We don't want to cool the economy more than necessary, but we don't want Canadians to have to continue to live with elevated inflation either. And we cannot let high inflation become entrenched in the economy. If inflationary pressures persist, we are prepared to raise our policy rates further to restore price stability.
This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
This year, the federal government is borrowing $421 billion in the open market, and the bank is not purchasing that debt. Is it safe to say that that is a contributing factor to the rise in rates that we've seen? In fact, most recently, even when the bank has not increased its policy rate.
Well, government borrowing actually in public markets has gone down. During the COVID crisis, they had very large borrowing needs. As they've reduced their spending, their borrowing needs have come down substantially. And I guess I would add just on that, you have to compare Canada to other countries. Canada's deficit to GDP ratio is the lowest in the G7. Canada's borrowing needs are a lot lower than many other countries.
I have to break in here, and I quote from last week's presser. The U.S. deficit means a lot more bonds being issued, meaning increase in supply has to be absorbed, and that pushes prices up a bit. The U.S. is doing $2 trillion this year, Canada doing $421 billion. That's a record, and no one is talking about that having a contributing factor. Interest rates. Mrs. Rogers, could you just mention whether you believe that it's a factor that interest rates are going up because of government borrowing?
Well, as we said in the press conference last week, there's a number of things. You're talking about just a sharp rise in the long-term yields on bonds. And as we said in the press conference last week, there's a number of things that are contributing to that. There's the term structure. We talked about, as you said, I think the quote you just gave was mine. I think the other thing I said is we're not seeing that same increase in Canada. We haven't had the same effect of
the 5 year. With respect, the 5 year moved up a bunch of basis points, and without the policy rate moving.
Yeah, and there's a number of things contributing to that. It's
including the government borrowing.
That's the time. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Governor, I had occasion to look at the Housing Affordability Index, and it was interesting that your bank publishes in 2015 at the tail end of Mr. Harper's administration, the index was at 32%. Today, under this Liberal administration, it's at 51%. So it certainly highlights the problem that we are in a housing crisis. Now, one of the things that you said last week that I thought was interesting, and it might have been Governor Rogers that was talking about it, is that there's normally and historically a correlation between interest rates and housing prices. So, for example, if interest rates go up, housing prices come down somewhat. If interest rates come down, housing prices go up somewhat. But you said something interesting that I wanted to get clarification on, and it had to do, you said that the reason housing prices are not declining as expected was because of the structural shortage of housing supply. I wonder if you could comment on specifically what you meant by that, briefly if you could, because my time is limited.
Actually, I think Senior Deputy Governor made those comments. So.
Yeah, I mean, very briefly, what we mean by a structural supply problem is that demand has and continues to run well ahead of supply of housing. And as the governor said earlier, that's been a problem that's been around for at least a decade. I think it was exacerbated through the COVID crisis when we were all spending more time in our houses and wanted more house or to relocate. So we saw a really extreme run-up in prices.
But I'm curious as to your thoughts as to what will happen to housing prices as you start to lower rates, given the inelasticity of supply, the structural problem in getting housing built in this country. What do you think would happen?
Well, I think all things being equal, we might see a bit of an uptick in housing demand again. But, as the governor said, we're really pleased to see the coordinated effort across multiple levels of government to try and address some of the supply issues. And again, it's more than interest rates that are going to need to change to solve the housing.
Yeah. I'll just add, I mean, we know what happened when we did raise rates to emergency low levels during the pandemic. Housing prices went up 50% in 2 years. Part of that was just everybody was at home all day. They wanted a bigger house, but partly interest rates were at emergency low levels. Cost of financing was low. So we don't predict every asset price, every price in the economy. But yes, I think what that points out is we had a supply problem at low interest rates. We have a supply problem at high interest rates. Obviously, interest rates have a big impact on the housing sector. It's very interest sensitive. But we're not going to solve the housing shortage with interest rates.
Payment shock coming for most Canadians with mortgages, RBC says, by 2026, when $400 billion worth of mortgages are set to renew, increase in monthly payments could be as high as 48%. They went on to say that by 2025, credit losses will inevitably rise. So this is affecting real people in real time. And one of the things I want to ask you is, let's say that you determine that market factors were sufficient to start bringing rates down at some point. Would you wait until the monetary policy report, quarterly report, was coming out, or would you act earlier as soon as that information came to your attention?
Well, normally we unless there's a very immediate emergency, normally we act at our fixed action dates, which is 8 times per year. 4 of those times we have a monetary policy report, but we've demonstrated that consistently that we can change interest rates at meetings without a monetary policy report. So yes.
We had an exchange back in spring of 2022. We've known each other for a while now, Mr. Macklem, but Governor Macklem. So I asked you about the financial or the inflationary impact of the carbon tax. And I have seen it misquoted by both politicians and reporters. So I want to clear up something like that, clear this up. What you said, or what you wrote, actually, I've got it here, is that, and I'll just read it here for ease of everyone. According to bank calculations, if the charge were to be removed from 3 main fuel components of the consumer price index, gasoline, natural gas, and fuel oil, it would reduce the inflation rate by 0.4 percentage. What's been quoted throughout by politicians and journalists as well is actually the increase that you said, which would be 0.1 or 0.1.5. I've seen as well. And so we've already had one increase. So if I can add 0.4 to the 0.1 or 0.1.5, I've also seen quoted, that would be 5 or 50 or 55 basis points. Is that, am I understanding you correctly in that?
Yeah, that's pretty good. So I'll give you the updated numbers.
Yeah.
So there's really 2 separate questions. So one question is, because the carbon tax is going up, right, over time. Mm-hmm. So one question is, how much are the increases in the carbon tax adding to inflation each year? And that number is about 0.15 percentage points of inflation.
Got it.
And that's the direct impact on those 3 components.
Perfect, thank you.
The second question you asked me was, what would be the effect if the carbon tax, what would be the effect on inflation if the carbon tax was eliminated? And that would create a one-time drop in inflation of 0.6 percentage points.
Okay.
So that would last 1 year. And since you can only eliminate it once, the next year it would have no effect on inflation.
For sure.
One of your primary objectives as the Bank of Canada, and this is from your website, says we influence the supply of money circulating in the economy using a monetary policy framework to keep inflation low and stable. So that's your main goal, is to hit that target on inflation. So while you're using your tools, raising interest rates and tightening up the money supply, now you're saying that the fiscal policy, the government's policy, its spending policy, is not being helpful. Did I understand that correctly?
What I said was, over the past year, government spending at all levels, federal and provincial, looks, by our estimates, has grown at less than 2%, so has not been getting in the way of getting inflation down. Looking forward, our estimate is that it will grow slightly faster than supply. And against that background, yes, it could begin to make it harder to get inflation down.
So it's going to undo, and I take your point about the past is the past. We're here to advise the government.
On the
We're
future.
here to provide submissions for the fall economic statement and the budget. So going forward, increases in spending will make your job more difficult, will undo some of the work that you've done with interest rates.
It will definitely make it more difficult to get inflation down. if all that spending is spent.
Thank you very much for that clarification. If you got to the target rate sooner, if you're able to get inflation down with these interest rate hikes that are affecting all Canadians with any kind of debt, mortgage, line of credit, if you got to that sooner, would you be in a position where you could start to consider lowering interest rates?
Yes, if inflation, the sooner we see clear evidence that inflation is headed back towards the 2% target, the sooner we can start discussing reducing interest rates. We don't need to wait until it's back to 2%, but we need to wait until we're clearly on a path till 2%.
So you've already acknowledged that the carbon tax would be, you say 0.6% off inflation?
For 1 year.
Okay, but it is important to remember that like inflation is cumulative, like so it's not like you remove the carbon tax, inflation automatically pops up the year after that.
Well, prices are cumulative. Inflation is the rate of change of prices, so
yes,
it
yes.
falls
So the
out
prices
after
would,
a year.
Right. So I just think that's an important clarification.
Senior Deputy Governor, I just want to clarify because we had a bit of a back and forth before my last round. But I think I heard you agree that it's possible that the market is demanding a higher interest rate in order to absorb the record amount of government debts, all government debts. And I'll note that most of the debt being rolled over this year by the federal government is debt it incurred during COVID, and I'll say negligently borrowed at the short end of the curve. But isn't it possible, or would you agree that the market is actually demanding a higher interest rate because it has to absorb that amount of borrowing?
Whenever there's more debt being issued, there's more competition, so prices will go up. But
Okay, thank you very much. Governor, you mentioned in the press conference last week about the path to a soft landing is now narrower. My sense of it is the risk now is greater that we will have some kind of economic event or uncertainty that in normal times would demand a lowering of the interest rate. But if we can't get inflation down before that happens, and now it looks like 2025. So if we have some kind of reason to lower the rate before 2025, before inflation comes down, that we're not going to be able to lower the policy rate in order to deal with that economic shock. Is that?
As long as inflation is well above the target, it will certainly be harder.
Right. So it'll prevent us, high inflation staying around till 2025 will prevent the bank from acting to support the economy if we don't have inflation under control.
It will make it harder. It depends obviously on the size of the shock. If it's a big enough shock, the downward pressure on inflation as a result could cause us to reconsider our rates. But yes, I largely agree that when you're starting from a position when inflation is above target and has been there for 2 years, you have less scope to lower interest rates and stimulate growth.
So kind of underscores the importance of governments at all levels of taking all the necessary steps they have in their toolbox in order to lower inflation, to basically make that narrow path as wide as possible in order for the bank to be able to act if it needs to act. Is that fair?
I think that's fair.
Okay. Perhaps when premiers write you a letter, were you just screaming inside wanting to write back 2 words, stop spending?
With respect to the letters, I know you're all hearing from your constituents. I know the premiers are hearing from their constituents. And this is putting more focus on inflation. It's putting more focus on interest rates. And I think that's a good thing. And look, as I've said already, I think it would be helpful if governments at all levels were considering the inflationary consequences of their spending decisions when they take those decisions.
And I think we're going to find, StatsCan will report the new poverty line statistics early this year. I think it's January or February. The number of households or individuals that will now fall below the poverty line because inflation is going to be quite high. And I suspect, as you said before, inflation hurts the vulnerable the most, so it's important. If we don't get this right, it's the vulnerable people that will suffer most, correct?
I agree.